So, first off, I'm going to read what this doctrine of total depravity means, and I'm getting this from Wikipedia. So for T, total depravity. This is also called total inability. It asserts that as a consequence of the fall of man into sin, every person is enslaved to sin. People are not by nature inclined to love God, but rather to serve their own interests and to reject the rule of God. Thus, all people by their own faculties are morally unable to choose to trust God for their salvation and be saved. The term total in this context refers to sin affecting every part of a person.
Today I'd like to look into this issue of total depravity. We have covered some of these issues in other videos. I will place them in the description if you'd like to look into this further. The problem that I'm having with some of the videos by Pastor McMurtry is that I'm not really sure where we do differ. So he does mention that he agrees with a lot of these things, but I'm not sure what priority he places on the areas that he does not agree. So as I go through, I'm going to try to discern that, pick some things out. As his position is presented, I'm going to attempt to give you the Reformed perspective, or the other side of that.
There is the definition, and you'll notice that a lot of that sounds really good. And the thing that I think, the way I often explain Calvinism, it is a perversion of truth. It is a perversion of the doctrines of grace, because of the fact that they're, in some ways, they say a lot of things that are right, but they like to just slip in some leaven. And some of the things they say are really close to right. But you'll find where they're wrong and where the differences are, they are big deals. And, Satan, he likes to just throw in a little lie. He just likes to twist a little bit. If it's too obvious, then everybody's going to see right through it. And so Calvinism can be very tricky. So
what I'd like to do first of all is, rather than using the definition from Wikipedia, I go directly to a Calvinistic source in defining the idea of total depravity or total inability. Now what I'm looking at here is the book, The 5 Points of Calvinism, Defined, Defended, and Documented, by David N. Steele and Curtis C. Thomas. This is a rather old book. I've had this for a couple of decades now. But in here we have a somewhat of a definition, I think, that may be of help. As a result of this inborn corruption, which I'll go to explain here in a second, the natural man is totally unable to do anything spiritually good. Thus, Calvinists speak of man's total inability. The inability intended by this terminology is spiritual inability. It means that the sinner is so spiritually bankrupt that he can do nothing pertaining to his salvation. It is quite evident that many unsaved people, when judged by man's standards, do possess admirable qualities and do perform virtuous acts. But in the spiritual realm, that's very important, when judged by God's standards, the unsaved sinner is incapable of good. The natural man is enslaved to sin. He is a child of Satan, rebellious toward God, blind to truth, corrupt, and unable to save himself or to prepare himself for salvation. In short, the unregenerate man is dead in sin, and his will is enslaved to his evil nature. To explain this, you go back to Genesis. You go to the garden. Adam and Eve are in the garden. They're told by God in Genesis chapter 2, if you eat of this fruit, you shall surely die. Now, of course, we know what happened. They ate of the fruit. Death sets in, but it's not just physical death which took years in coming, but we have immediately a spiritual death. And we have man's separation from God. This evidenced itself immediately. What they did after the fall was they went and hid from the presence of God. They went away from God, clothed themselves with fig leaves, and tried to stay away from God among the trees of the garden. God was the one who had to search for them. He then replaced their fig leaves with proper clothing, tunics of leather. So we find this had happened. Now, how was man described after the fall? Adam was created in a state of innocence. He had the ability to choose righteousness and obedience to God, or he had the ability also to choose evil and rebellion. He had a genuine free will when it came to spiritual things. I believe it's a mistake to think that we have that same ability, because we are not in that state of innocence. We have that inherited corruption which came from the fall. Romans 5:12, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. The spiritual death means that we are now, as a whole, as a race of humanity, we are dead to the things of the Spirit. 1 Corinthians 2:14, but the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. David shows this corruption in Psalm 51, verse 5. In sin did my mother conceive me. In other words, even at his conception, he was affected by this corruption. Ephesians 2 speaks of a death that shows that we are wedded to trespasses and sins, and that by nature we are, that is by natural generation, we are the children of wrath. John 3, Jesus tells us that in order to see the kingdom of God, we have to be born from above. The Spirit has to do his work in order for us to even to be able to see the Spirit of God. This corruption shows itself in the heart of man. Genesis chapter 6 describes quite vividly the heart of man. Every imagination of the heart was only evil continually. In Genesis 8:21, that was Genesis 6, and Genesis 8:21, it says that it's evil from his youth. So the heart, Jeremiah 17:9, is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. That is, the very inner core being of man has been affected by this corruption. Ecclesiastes 9:3, the hearts of men are full of evil and madness. And Mark 7:21 through 23, Jesus confirmed this, that out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, fornications, theft, etc. So Jesus was pinpointing that it's not these outward things that make you good or bad. It's what's coming from within, your corrupt heart. How does this reveal? So what we're saying is that in the core of man's being, in man's heart, every aspect of man, as it flows out from man, his thoughts, his words, his deeds, everything about him has this effect of corruption and sin. But that also translates into his reception of the gospel. How is the gospel received by the natural man? 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 18 says, for the message of the cross, the preaching of the cross, is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. So it is received from the carnal man as foolishness. 23 verse 23 says, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. So the gospel itself is perceived by religious men as offensive or as a stumbling block, and as the Gentiles or the pagans as foolishness, or the high-minded people of the world, it's looked at as foolishness. So I have an assignment for you, is when you discuss spiritual things, you want to give the gospel to your friends or family or people out on the street or whatever, notice their reaction. Notice how they receive this spiritual message of the gospel. It is not received with open arms. One of the things I remember after my conversion was I thought, wow, this is wonderful, knowing I'm going to heaven, knowing that my sins are forgiven, that I now can have a relationship with God. I'm going to share that with my friends. And I was in high school, and I went to my friends, and rather than oh, wow, Jeff, I'm so glad that you discovered this, and I'd like to know more about it, they just looked at me funny. They looked at me like, what, Jeff, what's happened to you? you got religion. And what it does, it drove a wedge between us, and they went their way and I went mine, because they did not want to deal with the spiritual things that I now wanted to talk about. And so we see this in the message of the preaching of the word. Romans chapter 8, verse 5, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. This is important here, because there is a distinction between the carnal mind and the spiritual mind. It's possible the spiritual man, the man who's been renewed by the Spirit of God, is going to have the remnants of sin and be battling with that. But there is a distinction. When we talk about the carnal man, those who are walking according to the flesh, living according to the flesh, and you have those who are spiritually minded. Now, they have been renewed by the Spirit. They have the possession of the Holy Spirit. There's a distinction here. And it goes on in verse 7, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. So then, those who are of the flesh, or in the flesh, cannot please God. So those who are in the flesh, they cannot understand the things of God. They cannot be submissive to the things of God, and they cannot please God in any way, spiritually. So if the spiritual message of the gospel is presented to these people that are in their depraved state, then they're going to not be able to understand it. They're not going to have the ability, the spiritual capabilities of understanding it. That's what we mean by total depravity. Jesus said in John 6:61, when Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained about this, that is, this hard message he was teaching. You had to consume him, you had to eat him, you had to eat his flesh and drink his blood. He said to them, does this offend you? What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit, and they are life. But there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who would betray him. And he said, therefore I have said to you, no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father. It takes a spiritual awakening. Now, later in this message by Pastor McMurtry, he's going to agree that there has to be some type of divine work before a man can come. So yes, we would be in agreement with that. And that's where I have some of the issues. I don't know where we would disagree in that. And hopefully that'll come out as we go on.
Tricky. So you'll notice one of the things it said, it mentioned original sin in there. Original sin is another thing that this is a big Catholic doctrine. I'm more familiar with the Catholic version of this. So hopefully I represent original sin correctly when talking about Calvinism. I've not heard a lot.
I was looking over this video and wanted to add something here at this point. If Mr. McMurtry has a difficult time discerning between the Roman Catholic concept of original sin and the Reformed concept of original sin and how it's dealt with, then perhaps he ought to refrain from teaching on it when he comes to this point. Now, that's where we get into conjectures and wondering what the other people believe, and then teaching upon straw men, I guess you'd say. So we'll try to cover some of this as we go on, and it looks like it's going to take another video. So if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. May the Lord bless you in your search for truth.